Life is very difficult, one of the most ancient of religious ideas that emerges everywhere, I would say, is that life is essentially suffering. I have something in common with Nazis in that I am opposed to the radical left. And when you oppose the radical left, you end up being a part of a much larger group that includes Nazis in it. It's very hard to find your own words, and you don't actually exist until you have your own words. To me, ideology is corrupt. It's a parasite on religious structures. To be an ideologue is to have all of the terrible things that are associated with religious certainty, and none of the utility. If you're an ideologue, you believe everything that you think. If you're religious, there's a mystery left there. You can't go backward in life. Part of the core information that I've been purveying is that identity politics is a sick game. You don't play racial, ethnic, and gender identity games. The left plays them on behalf of the oppressed, let's say, and the right tends to play them on behalf of nationalism and ethnic pride. I think they're equally dangerous. To master a new technology, you have to play with it. You should do what other people do, unless you have a very good reason not to. Men and women aren't the same, and they won't be the same. That doesn't mean that they can't be treated fairly. Become aware of your own insufficiency. If you're not going to be rewarded for your virtues, and instead you're going to be punished for them, then what's your motivation to continue? To play with it, you should do what other people do, unless you have a very good reason not to. Men and women aren't the same, and they won't be the same. That doesn't mean that they can't be treated fairly. Become aware of your own insufficiency. If you're not going to be rewarded for your virtues, and instead you're going to be punished for them, then what's your motivation to continue? The people who hold that our culture is an oppressive patriarchy, they don't want to admit that the current hierarchy might be predicated on competence. There were some great clinicians in the 20th century, great men. Freud was a genius. Jung was a genius. Carl Rogers was a genius. There's a half-dozen psychologists of the 1950s and humanists of the 1960s. You can't have a value structure without a hierarchy. They're the same thing, because a value structure means one thing takes precedence over another. The masculine spirit is under assault. It's obvious. I could hardly sit through Frozen. There was an attempt to craft a moral message and to build the story around that, instead of building the story and letting the moral message emerge. It was the subjugation of art to propaganda, in my estimation. It's very difficult to regulate yourself, and if you learn to do that, well, it starts to spill over. We're so immaturely cynical as a culture. We're not wise enough to look at an institution like marriage and to really think about what it means and what it signifies. It signifies a place where people can tie the ropes of their lives together so that they're stronger. It signifies a place where people can tell the truth to one another. Once someone has spent enough time cultivating bad habits and biding their time, they are much diminished. Much of what they could have been has dissipated. We have to rediscover the eternal values and then live them out. I have a hard time figuring out what kind of box to put me in, too, because I don't know exactly what's going on around me or why. But I need to stay outside of boxes, because then I can look at what's inside of them without being part of them. The most propagandistic element of Frozen was the transformation of the prince at the beginning of the story, who was a perfectly good guy, into a villain with no character development whatsoever about 3/4 of the way to the ending. I like working class people, generally speaking. It's not just human nature to associate in tribes. It's deeper than that. As pessimistic as I am about the nature of human beings and our capacity for atrocity and malevolence and betrayal and laziness and inertia and all those things, I think we can transcend all that and set things straight. It's a small percentage of people who do the 80-hour-a-week high-powered career thing. and they're almost all men. Why? Well, men are driven by socio-economic status more than women. You may say, well, dragons don't exist. It's like, yes they do, the category predator and the category dragon are the same category. It absolutely exists. It's a superordinate category. It exists absolutely more than anything else. In fact, it really exists. If you learn a martial art, you learn to be dangerous, but simultaneously, you learn to control it. I am not going to be a mouthpiece for language that I detest, assuming if there's such a thing as reality. If you have a false relationship with it, how can you do anything but fail? You can think of the entire internet as a place where ideas embodied in cyberspace are having a war. And it's not much different than the war of gods in heaven, which has been taking place since there's been human beings. A properly balanced story provides an equal representation of the negative and positive attributes of, I could say the world, but it's actually a being. Harry Potter's a good example. So Harry's the hero, right, but he's tainted with evil. There's a dark and a light in every bit of that narrative. It's well balanced. Part of the reason there's an injunction to the truth, for example, is that if you're in a circumstance of extreme uncertainty, your best weapon, let's say, or your best tool or your best defense is the truth, because it keeps things simpler. If you're a social scientist worth your salt, you never do a univariate analysis. You have to listen very carefully and tell the truth if you are going to get a paranoid person to open up to you. I'm interested in what motivates individuals to participate in atrocious acts to support their ideological identification. I've studied authoritarianism for a very long time, for 40 years, and they're started by people's attempts to control the ideological and linguistic territory. That's another hallmark of truth, is that it snaps things together. People write to me all the time and say it's as if things were coming together in my mind. It's like the Platonic idea that all learning was remembering. You have a nature, and when you feel that nature articulated, it's like the act of snapping the puzzle pieces together. I do believe that there are places where the mythological and the literal touch. I happen to be a big fan of Western civilization. I think it beats the hell out of tyranny and starvation. I've known for years that the university underserved the community because we assumed that university education is for 18 to 22-year-olds, which is a proposition that's so absurd it is absolutely mind-boggling that anyone ever conceptualized it. Why wouldn't you take university courses throughout your entire life? You can say, well, isn't it unfortunate that chaos is represented by the feminine? Well, it might be unfortunate, but it doesn't matter, because that is how it's represented. It's been represented like that forever, and there are reasons for it. You can't change it. It's not possible. This is underneath everything. I'm a practical person, and not too bad a carpenter. I can renovate houses. People have been fed this diet of pabulum, rights, and impulsive freedom. There's just an absolute starvation for the other side of the story. If you want to occupy the C-suite or the top 0.1% in any organization, you have to be obsessively devoted to your career at the expense of everything else. And women look at that and they think, no. Obviously, I'm no fan of the radical left. The narrow bandwidth of TV has made us think that we are stupider than we are. All things considered, there's nobody better for children than parents. The connection between psychology, mythology, and literature is as important as the connection between psychology and biology and the hard sciences. The book, 12 Rules for Life, is a very serious book. There's elements of humor in it, but I'm trying to struggle with things at the deepest possible level and to explain to people why it's necessary to live a upstanding and noble and moral and truthful and responsible life, and why there's hell to pay if you don't do that.